All right, Chris, shall we kick off?
Absolutely.
Let's do it. Okay, well, thanks so much to everyone who's joining us here today and who's rewatching this as part of the IASC conference. My name is Harriet Brettle. I'm the head of business analysis at Astroscale. And I'm really thrilled to be here today with a fantastic lineup of panelists to talk about decommissioning in extreme environments and insights for the space industry. With that, I'm going to hand over to my fantastic co-moderator, Chris Newman, who's going to introduce our guest for today. Thanks, Chris.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Harriet, and thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. This is a really interesting discussion. It's a discussion that I think is necessary at this time as space becomes busier and particular orbits become more crowded. What we've got now is a need to remove the satellites that have ended their useful life and reduce the number of non-operational satellites. The proliferation of space debris leads to higher risks, increased costs, and potentially unusable orbits. Now, trying to return the environment back to its natural state isn't without precedent on Earth. While the space domain is a unique one, and we don't sort of pretend that there are things that can be transposed directly, the issues faced by the space community are not unique. Industries surrounding the world's energy resources, all to varying degrees, consider how to deal with assets that pose a danger to the environment once they've reached the end of their operational life. This process, known as decommissioning, is undertaken across the oil and gas, nuclear, and even the nascent wind power generation industries. With the growing awareness for the need for consideration of end-of-life practices, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce three experts from across industry, from across different industries, so that we can really engage in some multidisciplinary learning. In this panel, we're going to try and discuss these shared challenges, and we're going to really see what lessons we in the space industry can learn from these more mature decommissioning industries. So the panel that we've got for you, I am so proud to be a part of. I'm so proud to be working with, because they're absolutely amazing. I'm going to start with Sara Huntingdon, Head of Innovation at the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. Sara joined the NDA in July 2019. She's tasked with driving and enabling more innovative approaches in nuclear decommissioning. She started her career at BNFL Magnox Generation and has worked in a wide variety of project management, R&D delivery and business change roles within the UK government. This included projects and cross-cutting programs for the UK Space Agency and the Ministry of Defence. So thanks so much for joining us, Sara. We've also got Yanal Abul Failat, oil and gas lawyer with LXL. Now, Yanal principally advises mining and oil and gas companies globally on contentious and non-contentious matters. This looks at corporate governance, mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, licensing regulation, and also petroleum contracts across the entire supply chain, upstream, midstream, and downstream. He's got cross-border experience in major corporate transactions and projects across Europe, Middle East, Russia, and Southeast Asia. And I also know Yanal because he has a great interest and a great knowledge of national and international space law. And then finally, but by no means least, we have Dr. Emma Taylor, safety engineer and past chair of the Safety and Reliability Society. Dr. Taylor is a safety and risk engineer with over 25 years experience across space, energy and transport sectors. She's worked for the European Space Agency, led a standards team developing global ISO standards for mitigation of orbital debris, and she now drives forward awareness of digital safety and cybersecurity in all forms of transport through the whole life cycle. Emma was named a top 50 woman engineer in 2018 and was listed in the Cranfield School of Management 100 Women to Watch as part of the FTSE board report. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with an introductory question to everyone. I'll start with Sara and then we'll go to Yanal, we'll go to Emma. But Sara, why should we care? And why do you care about decommissioning?
Thanks, Chris. So probably get a bit of context, really. I came into the nuclear sector straight from university as the first fleet of the civil nuclear power stations were kind of reaching the end of their operating life. And even though they stopped generating electricity, there were still complex industrial sites there that were at the heart of local communities that still, even though they'd been defueled, contained a number of residual hazards. So as part of being a responsible employer, and you've got a legal responsibility in terms of managing that health and safety, environmental protection. I think we also have that kind of moral responsibility and that social responsibility to deal with those sites, because that nuclear legacy was something that my generation and previous generations have actually created and benefited from. And I think we owe it to future generations and the local communities that give us permission to put those sites there. We need to finish the job, and we need to return that land back to future reuse, whether that's for new power stations or different sectors. So I think another area I'm really passionate about is decommissioning enables growth. So if we want to encourage clean growth and future nuclear energy being part of the energy mix, we need to deal with the legacy that we've got, and we're not going to have a successful new build programme in the UK unless we deal with that decommissioning legacy. So that's kind of why I'm passionate about it.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And already, and I'm sure you're the same, already the questions how we can learn these lessons for space are sort of firing around. Yanal, sir, lovely to see you. Please, why should we care about decommissioning?
Hello, everyone, and thanks for the invite, and thanks for everyone attending as well. I guess similarly to nuclear decommissioning or nuclear-related decommissioning, oil and gas, does pose environmental risks, and oil and gas companies do have moral obligations in a similar fashion to those that Sara describes. The key concerns in the oil and gas industry, really, when you're looking at this decommissioning, is twofold. You firstly want to manage the potential environmental impacts of leaving facilities offshore or elsewhere, for instance, from the risk of oil leakage or other chemical leaks, but also for navigational safety reasons. So I think everybody who's in favor of decommissioning and stringent decommissioning regulations really comes from a very basic place, which is pick up your waste when you complete your project. So that's the key concern, and that's that's the greatest motivation for decommissioning regulation and promoting this type of environmental concern.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. What a simple message, actually. Pick up your waste. That's a really good motif to take forward. Thank you so much, Yanal. Emma, lovely to see you again. Lovely to be on a panel with you again. Why do we care about decommissioning?
Well, for me, coming from a safety and reliability background, for me, decommissioning is no more or no less than a mindset. Decommissioning isn't a standalone step, it's an integral part of the project lifecycle. And just as you can't make a cake missing a key ingredient, you can't do a project without considering decommissioning. Because as you step through the stages of a project lifecycle, when you're there at the concept phase, if you want to make sure that you achieve your overall missions and hit the sustainability target of leaving the orbital resource, leaving the planet in the right condition, then you have to start to think at the beginning what the end might look like. And you need to consider a range of reasonably foreseeable scenarios, because as much as we might want to, we can't be sure what condition a satellite or orbital resource is going to be in 25 or 30 years' time. So it is a mindset. It's anticipating the different combinations and permutations of the future. It's thinking about the sustainability perspective, and also recognizing that the world is real, the engineering challenges are real, and we have to be able to adapt. So that's, for me, why decommissioning is important.
That's perfect. Thank you, Emma. So to everyone who's here listening, please do put any questions that you have in the chat. We're going to make sure we've got time for audience Q&A at the end, and we very much want to hear from all of you. So please do join us in the discussion. My next question I have is for Sara and Yanal. So I want to learn a little bit more about practically what decommissioning means in these other industries, because when we think about space, we're thinking about, I guess, primarily removing satellites and pieces of debris from protected or operational orbits and returning the environment back to its natural state. What does that look like in your industries, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities you're facing when it comes to decommissioning? Sara, if I could start with you. Thank you.
So in terms of how we go about decommissioning assets in the nuclear sector, I'd say carefully and collaboratively, and particularly so for high hazard facilities. So there's lots and lots of papers on the internet about how you would decommission a power station. For example, defueling, decontamination, sort of demolishing ancillary buildings, those sorts of things. So I'm not going to go into detail of that, but ultimately you're trying to reduce risk. And you're doing that in well-controlled stages, and ultimately you're trying to reduce the physical footprint of the site itself and get it back to a state for future reuse. So previously, the policy was that we were preparing sites for long-term safe storage. But because obviously with radiation, the longer you leave it, the safer it becomes. But that introduces other challenges as well. You're dealing with aging infrastructure. So that policy has been recently revisited, and we're now moving towards a policy of continuous reactor decommissioning. So in terms of the challenges, I suppose it's a bit like the space sector is currently finding that it's not just about the technology. You're part of a much bigger ecosystem, and there are cultural aspects to that. There are different stakeholders' needs that need to be met. Politics inevitably gets involved, and money as well. So in terms of the UK, we're one of the first nations globally to have we were one of the first to have a civil nuclear power programme, and we're also one of the first to start trying to do decommissioning of that legacy commercial fleet. So there will be common themes where technologies can be applied across different sites, but no two sites are the same. So because the technology was evolving, it was the nuclear race. So and as we learned things, the technology and the designs improved. So we do encounter many first-of-a-kind challenges. And so I think understanding the risk and where there may be uncertainty, and as Emma mentioned, having a good understanding of the current state of your assets is really, really important. I think in terms of challenges, I think, we've talked about it briefly, standardization is probably quite key, as is a healthy regulatory environment. In terms of opportunities, I work in technology and innovation, so having a range of options that enable you to deal with a whole range of different situations within the bounds of affordability is also really important. And that's something the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, which I've worked for, invests quite heavily in, because we need to make sure that in future we've got those options that we can draw upon from the supply chain. And that really drives us down an interest in things like advanced sensors, modern asset management and monitoring approaches, looking at things like robotics, and adopting new technologies as well, and keeping abreast of those new technologies. And because we're one of the first to go into this decommissioning journey, there's a real opportunity there for the UK to take a lead and also export our know-how and experience and how we do things to other nations as well. So it fits into that wider ecosystem about enabling growth as well.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. And there's so many things that you said where I was thinking, how do we join the dots for the space sector? It's really interesting. Yanal, is there anything you want to add from the oil and gas perspective?
Well, again, there are a lot of similarities, and similarly to what Sarah's explained, there's no one way to decommission an offshore installation or an oil and gas well. But you do see patterns, and you do see lessons learned from different parties. But this technical element actually goes at the heart of the UK regulation. The way it works here is that at some point, which is when you're nearing the development phase of an oil and gas project, you have to deliver something called the decommissioning plan. And you deliver that to a governmental entity called the BEIS in the UK, and that's in consultation with the Oil and Gas Authority. Now, the purpose of this plan is to actually explain how a licensee of an oil and gas license is looking to decommission its offshore installations and also wells at the end of the operational life of their project or their field. Now, with offshore installations, you see a lot of decommissioning happening through vessels, lifting parts of the installation. Sometimes they're removed completely and decommissioned on land, on mainland. And when you're looking at wells, really, you don't decommission wells, you do something called abandonment and plug-in. And that type of setup is really placing some cement ceilings on the wells to interrupt and avoid any oil and gas leakage. So that's the technical side of things, let's say. But when it comes to the regulation, you have two streams of regulation that apply to decommissioning in the UK, at least for oil and gas. And one of them is fed in through the licensing regime. And it mainly regulates how you decommission a well. And as I said, you have to abandon and plug a well. When you're looking at offshore installations, you're regulated under the Petroleum Act, and that requires essentially three key things. One is to remove completely all your installations at the end of the operational life of your project. You have some derogations that are allowed through international law as implemented in the UK, but these are very limited in nature. And you could request sometimes to even leave your installations if you can prove that technically and environmentally that's the best solution that you have at the moment. This is the way that it works. And then the government will issue you something called a Section 29 notice, and that would put a licensee on notice of its obligation to decommission. And then that will be supplemented also by a requirement which the Secretary of State can request to put funds up front for securing the decommissioning obligations. As you can imagine, these oil and gas projects run for many, many years, sometimes 20 and 30 years. And one company's appetite or a licensee's appetite to pay for decommissioning at the end of a very long project might be very low in comparison to when they were making money at the beginning of their dealings, whether in the exploration or the production fields. So it's also, the UK regulation aims at securing these obligations from the outset. And I think that's something that could be applied to the space sector. How do you request companies to put this money up front? It's all a matter of securing security. And if you have multiple parties involved in a space operation, how do you allocate liability between these parties? And it then goes back to all your corporate and project finance arrangements of arranging finance, allocating liability, arranging for future security, and so on. So this is the general framework that oil and gas companies operate in the UK. And if I have to add something, I can also say that pipelines are also decommissioned in a similar fashion to offshore installations. They're also regulated under the Petroleum Act, and they're subject to decommissioning programs being filed with the government and also upfront security.
Great, thanks, Yanal. Chris, back to you.
Yes, thanks so much. And again, you notice I'm hurriedly scribbling down ideas because there are so many things that are coming out of this. I should have said to the panelists that actually we're using you as sort of sources of information as well to take the study on to the next step. So thinking about that, the satellite industry and the space industry is at a very early stage of developing this thinking around this. And I know that your industries are much more advanced. Emma, I'm going to come to you in a minute and ask about specific safety angles. But Sarah, if I can start with you, there's a balance between encouraging technological development and regulatory enforcement. And it's we know that there's no easy answer to this. But how's the nuclear industry sort of tried to manage this?
Okay, so just as a bit of context, in the nuclear sector in the UK, we have a number of regulatory bodies. So one of those is the Office for Nuclear Regulation, which sits as an agency under the Health and Safety Executive. We also, our operations are also sort of overseen by the Environment Agency, and for Scotland, their equivalent SEPA. So the exact level of involvement of each of those different regulators will vary depending on the type of work that's been undertaken or that's being considered in future. So, and we're also party to a number of international agreements as well for things like stockpile management, things like that. So I'm not personally directly involved in the regulatory side of it, but I have spoken to colleagues about this, and there is a recognition that you need to have a continued proactive dialogue with your regulators. I think we all recognise doing nothing is not acceptable, and we're all kind of aligned around that common kind of understanding. And I think we all also realise that if we don't deal with the legacy together, we're not going to get a future build programme either. So again, it's all about this. The ecosystem feeds off this as well. Before I rejoined the sector, again, the whole nuclear sector in the UK on decommissioning side underwent a kind of a reorganisation and changed the organisations that were involved, and because they needed a fundamental shift in strategy, I suppose. They needed a body who was focusing on decommissioning at a strategic level, which is the NDA. And previous organisations also focused on things like operational services, developing new commercial products, and winning contracts. And I think it was recognised that that wasn't driving maybe the right sort of behaviours. I think in terms of how you balance it with technology, we all agree doing nothing is not an option because plants degrade over time. and that will lead to a certain outcome, which is not a favourable outcome. So the approach needs to recognise there is a balancing of risk and opportunity, and it's not a sort of a one-hit wonder dealing with a regulator. That dialogue is constant and ongoing, and you're having that discussion regularly about levels of risk and how to deal with that. The conversations are honest. You have to build trust over time. And just as an example of that, for example, the regulator sits regularly on some of the research and development fora that we host with the nuclear sector, because they are they're core part of that community. And it's better to know early on if the regulator has a concern about a new technology or how you're thinking of applying it, because then you can work with them to see how you can either overcome that or find a different way. You don't want to get to the end point and then realise it's not going to be acceptable. So I think the earlier you engage, the better, really. But I think they're not to be seen as someone who is, they are working with you to achieve something with you. They are not the enemy. And I think when I first came back into the sector, it's an often used excuse, the regulator won't like that. And I always counter that with, well, have you asked them? And I think, it's sometimes thrown up as a quick way of sort of deflecting work or a blocker. And I think actually, if you enter into that conversation, it's usually really well received.
That's brilliant, and I think that is something about the regulatory mindset and the mindset of those being regulated. I think is a really interesting question and what a conversation I think we're going to have in the space sector as well. Yanal, from your perspective, oil and gas, would you echo those thoughts about regulation being a process, a continuum, rather than a fixed point of the actual project?
Yes, I won't generalize, but definitely in the case of the UK, I think the legislation and the regulation is quite progressive and it's quite flexible. As I said earlier, you have different stages in an oil and gas project. And an upstream oil and gas project, it starts off with exploration, development and appraisal, production, and decommissioning. By the time you start your field development, it's usually the stage. It's not set in stone, but it's usually the stage at which you deliver your decommissioning program. So the fact that you have to deliver a decommissioning program shows you that the regulator here is also quite flexible in that it expects the oil and gas company to say to the regulator what it plans to do, rather than have the regulator saying to it how it should decommission its oil and gas facilities and its offshore installations. So in a sense, I think the way the UK is regulated at the moment caters for that development. And I think there's the right balance between the government imposing some obligations, namely to decommission as much as you can, versus allowing the companies to come back to the regulator and say, well, look, this is how we're going to do it. And this scheme will allow companies to develop year by year. I mean, you're pretty much complying with the same set of regulations, but 10 years later, you might be filing a completely different decommissioning program, that's in line with available technology. And as Sara said, did you ask the regulator if they're happy with a certain approach to decommission? And noting that the Oil and Gas Authority does not have a primary role in dealing with decommissioning, their actual role there is to support the oil and gas companies, is to speak to them about the solutions and the available technology, and see what's the best thing that they can help the companies to submit to the BEIS. So I think that's the lesson to be learned from the UK paradigm, which is, you don't have to set in stone the ways to decommission, but you can request companies to propose to you using available technology and reasonable funds to decommission in a certain way.
That's brilliant, thank you so much, and thank you, Sara, as well, because as you can imagine, the regulatory aspect of this is really interesting to me, and the fusion between the law, the policy and the regulator all sort of comes together here. So what I'm going to do is hand back to Harriet, because I know you want to explore some safety issues with Emma.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So Emma, I wanted to put a question to you in terms of understanding what lessons you think can be transferred from more of the safety and reliability side of other sectors when we're thinking about decommissioning and end-of-life practices for the satellite industry.
Thank you very much. It's a really interesting point, because I was starting with a mindset. I was starting with the language of a whole project life cycle, and I was starting with, at the beginning, think about a range of reasonably foreseeable scenarios and anticipate and plan for that. And as we were talking about this balance between technology and regulation, I was imagining a sort of seesaw, and I was drawing my little notes here, and I was realizing we're going to move from a seesaw not to a three-legged stool, but actually to a four-legged chair, which is going to give a bit of stability. Now, what are the other two legs? Unsurprisingly, as a long-standing safety engineer across multiple sectors, I'm going to say that safety, which is a process as well as an outcome, is one of those legs. But I'm also going to make a pitch in for standards as the fourth leg. Unsurprisingly, as a long-standing standards user, I'm a standards enthusiast and a standards nerd. Now, why are safety and standards a good sort of complement to that balance between technology and regulation? I talk about process and I talk about product. So a standard sets out the common industry consensus, and consensus is defined as the absence of sustained opposition in the ISO, International Standards Organization world. So it's everybody coming together and say, we agree collectively that if we all work together to this, this sets a suitable standard. So standards that are written for other sectors can help encourage thoughts, develop processes, and move towards that mindset. There is absolutely nothing stopping you going to pull a standard from the oil and gas, nuclear, or transport sectors and say, how could I apply this to decommissioning? A lot of brain power, a lot of effort, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into reaching that industry-focused consensus. So why not choose to use it? And then what else can we take from other sectors in terms of safety? Now, obviously, a rocket is not the same as a pipeline, is not the same as a nuclear reactor, you might think. But actually the fundamentals of how you do a safety analysis, you identify the hazards, the things with the potential to cause harm, you identify what the likelihood might be of those hazards realizing to incidences, and you think about the consequences. That, if you like, core foundation process, mindset, and to some degree imagination, what if, that you can do across all sectors. And because it's like a what if, you don't actually need to know the end answer, just imagine. And some of the most productive safety analyses I've done is when you take a bunch of people with a diverse background, and that's a key mix in the ingredient, and ask them to imagine what if could happen. And so, of course, there's a little bit more structure about how you take that initial thinking and then turning it into a safety argument and packaging it up in a safety case, which you then pass to the regulator. But at core, it's quite a simple process, quite a simple mindset. So kind of wrap up, I'd imagine going from the balance, which is important, of course, ask your regulator, and add two more legs, so you create a chair, put in safety and standards, and don't feel shy about looking at what other sectors do and saying, what can I take back to the space industry?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I think that the safety and reliability angles are really, really interesting, particularly when it comes to the space sector. When we think about satellite decommissioning, you know, there's a number of ways that satellites can be decommissioned. If we're thinking about spacecraft in LEO, typically that means re-entering in the Earth's atmosphere and burn up, right? But the status and the health and the safety of your satellite is a big determining factor, and whether you're able to do that yourself, whether you can use your own onboard propulsion, or if you're not operational when you reach end of life, potentially requiring a third-party service to do that debris removal for you. And I think there's a number of different elements you've mentioned there that can tie into that. Chris, I wanted to hand back to you to ask a legal question for our panel. Thanks.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I say to my students. If ever you want to understand a law, if ever you're sort of looking at a piece of legislation and you want to understand it, what it does and why it does something, you can do a lot worse than look at the year. Because if you look at the year of the statute, or you look at the year of the treaty or whatever, what you'll do is you'll unpack a whole range of sort of social, economic, cultural conditions that are operating at the time. Now, again, this is just accept this as a bare thesis that law tends to come from events. It doesn't always, that, you know, there are exceptions, but generally when when a disaster happens, there will be a legislative response, there will be a treaty response or so in some way. So, Yanal, I'm going to ask you the question first up. Do you think the space industry is inevitably going to wait for a catastrophe before progress can be made, or do you think there's an opportunity to sort of get ahead of that and try and avoid sort of reactive legislation and become a lot more proactive in our work?
Well, I think we have an obligation to avoid a catastrophe at any cost. You know, you can learn from your own mistakes and you can learn from other people's mistakes. And I think in the case of the space sector, it has the benefit of other people's mistakes and years of experience in similar environments. You've redefined a space problem today as a problem that occurs in extreme environments. So obviously, in a way, you can say that the space companies have already experienced catastrophes in the other sectors, and they can definitely learn from them. As Sara and Emma have said, there are a lot of similarities between these extreme environments and a lot of lessons learned. So I don't think the space sector needs to wait for a catastrophe. We already acknowledge the problem. I think there are a lot of people campaigning and have been campaigning for dealing with space debris for years now. And in this panel, we're discussing the issue of space debris, perhaps in a more specific way, which is decommissioning. So it's very clear that decommissioning is a must, and it has all sorts of benefits. And it's very clear that if it's not dealt with, there might be severe consequences. Now, having said that, the oil and gas sector is a sector that has learned from its own mistakes. And you know, there have been series of incidents over the years which have perhaps promoted or triggered the enactment of certain international conventions, and also on a local level, latest of which I think is the Brent Spar. And you mentioned that in your excellent report on decommissioning. Now, Brent Spar was definitely a catalyst for the oil and gas sector to develop what was perhaps not a very descriptive decommissioning regime that existed prior to Brent Spar. And it led into the development of the OSPAR decisions, which are essentially a series of decisions that were made on the back of the OSPAR Convention. Now, the OSPAR Convention regulates just a few states near the North Sea, and it's not a global convention like the London Convention is, but definitely it was enacted in response to the Brent Spar events. And you can see that since Brent Spar, a lot of the legal developments relating decommissioning happened around these OSPAR countries, which shows you there's a primary link between the Brent Spar events and the development of decommissioning in European countries and the UK. Perhaps in a more robust manner than other countries. So yes, definitely you can learn from catastrophes. I don't think space should learn from its own catastrophe. You know, Brent Spar, for instance, it brought the issue of decommissioning to the public arena. It showed everyone that the previous international conventions were inadequate. And yeah, people worked together and they developed what we have now, which is, you know, pretty much robust decommissioning regime, which mandates for almost absolute removal of your offshore installations, but with very specific and limited derogations. Because, you know, I think the first reference to a decommissioning obligation in international law was under the Geneva Convention. And, you know, it preceded my time, but I know that academically there was a huge debate as to whether the convention mandated an absolute obligation to remove the decommissioning offshore installations, or whether it allowed for some level of flexibility. And these are the competing interests that you have between the regulators and the oil and gas companies who are obliged to do the decommissioning. So yeah, a lot to be learned from cross industries, and you know, we don't have to do it in the space sector.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And Sara, there's obvious one word that springs to mind, and it's Chernobyl. Is there anything you kind of want to add to the sort of the law from catastrophe discussion?
It's a really interesting topic. Personally, of course, it is completely unacceptable to wait for a catastrophe before you act, is my view. However, there's a bit of psychology comes in here. Humans are hardwired to deal with the here and now, and you know, the current pandemic is a classic example of that. There will have been experts flagging this up for years in advance, and nobody did anything because it wasn't hurting them at the time. And that's, you know, that whichever sector you're in, I think that applies to all of us. So I think what you need to look at from a nuclear perspective point of view is having accidents in the nuclear sector have real implications and ramifications on people's daily lives. And we're all agreed that, you know, those scenarios are not things that we want to revisit. And I think for the space sector, I don't think people realise how reliant they are in their everyday life at the moment on space. and you take it for granted. So how do you get people realizing that they don't want to lose, access to the banking systems or the electricity grid and things we use the space, the satellites for, without, switching them all off and causing a mass riot kind of thing? So how can the space sector kind of simulate that catastrophe without actually having it? And I think there's an opportunity to think more creatively about how you go about raising that kind of public awareness and take the debate from a very niche, scientific debate from an expert and get that into a public, a more public domain and get people talking about it. Because the more I think people are aware of the implications of things, you create that consensus to act. And so I think I really hope the space sector can learn from other sectors and get ahead of the game on this, because I think if it does happen, people will suddenly wake up to how reliant they are on the space domain.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. Harriet, back to you.
Yeah, there were so many things in what Yanal and Sarah just said that I just want to quickly pick up on. Yanal, I love what you said about why wait for a catastrophe in your own sector when we can learn from catastrophes in others. It's such an important point, right? And there's a lot that we can see in terms of more established decommissioning regimes that could really raise the bar in terms of what the expectations are for the space industry when it comes to end of life and addressing the growing threat of space debris.
Yeah.
And then Sarah, exactly what you were saying as well, that there's a lot of opportunity here to recognize that whilst space debris may not pose a direct threat to human life, other than those few astronauts up in the International Space Station, it does pose a direct risk to our way of life here on Earth, right? And so that's something where I think that there's a lot more the space industry can do in terms of raising that awareness and promoting the value that space and satellite-enabled technology does for us here on Earth. So I'll go back to maybe one more question, and we want to make sure we've got time for the audience to chip in as well. We've talked a lot about different standards, consensus, regulations. I'd love to hear from our panelists here about how you think international consensus and standards can help to reduce the technical and regulatory risks associated with decommissioning. Maybe we can start with Emma on that one. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the link in to safety and standards about how that can reduce the risk from decommissioning. I was listening to the law from catastrophe discussion with absolute interest, because it's a great phrase, but it also represents what's happened in many sectors. And I like Yanal's point about learning from other sectors. There's no getting away from the fact that whether it's environmental impact or safety impact, whether it's transport, energy, and all forms of transport, whether rail or planes, the main substantive changes in law, for example, the ones that have come to sort of safety cases, which are often used now in the UK and more broadly and across multiple sectors, that came as a result of the accidents, which is unfortunate. And the perception here is that maybe people couldn't anticipate it. And I'm coming back to the phrase of reasonably foreseeable scenarios, anticipating that. And that's actually not just a phrase, it's actually encoded in sort of UK law, and it's actually implicit in the content of standards. How can standards help? So you don't need to be a safety expert to use the standard. You just need to sit and think back to yourself what could happen and what are the reasonably foreseeable scenarios. So we're also on the topic of decommissioning here. So I'm encouraging you to look beyond the sort of traditional, look beyond the current present, and look beyond your current sector. And I'm thinking that another thing to think about in terms of decommissioning is don't just think about catastrophe with a capital C, because catastrophe can happen in a big step function. It can end up in the media, or it can be a slow increasing series of small c catastrophes, if that doesn't sound like a contradiction. Because if you have a sequence of failures of components or guidance software or analysis that slowly ramps up bit by bit, all of a sudden you're going to find yourself in a position where decommissioning, as you had anticipated it, or as you might adapt to, no longer becomes possible, and then you need to look at third-party or independent solutions. So standards, in terms of that mindset and decommissioning and thinking about those reasonably foreseeable scenarios, can get you to sort of go through that series of small catastrophes and say, am I still ready and available to decommission?
That's great. Thank you, Emma. Yanal or Sara, anything to add to those points?
Well, I'm happy to complete my earlier answer. And basically, the Prendspar event, in a way, actually was not a catastrophe as much as it was an avoided catastrophe. So Prendspar involved a decommissioning plan that was not accepted by Greenpeace. Greenpeace then challenged that plan and pushed the government and Shell to reevaluate its decommissioning program and to look at it again. So actually, if I wanted to complete the answer that I gave earlier, is that you can even learn from an anticipated catastrophe. You know, nothing has to happen for you to develop your regulation into an environmentally careful way or considerate way. In terms of standardization, you know, I'm not familiar with safety, but when it comes to all the commercial agreements and all the commercial arrangements around the decommissioning obligations, there is a high level of standardization in the oil and gas industry. There's there are quite a few guidelines as well, which people can voluntarily choose to follow or not. And quite often these voluntary guides also tend to develop into something more binding along the future. So yes, there is a level of standardization. I do encourage it, and especially on a jurisdictional level. I don't think you can apply something from a contractual point of view on a global scale, but definitely you can have standard documents in the UK, for instance, for oil and gas companies doing decommissioning, or for all sorts of trust deeds and tax relief documents, etc. So yeah, I'm all for standardization, especially because it usually happens from the industry itself. You have institutions like Logic in the UK, which work very hard with the oil and gas companies to produce what they think is something that's generally accepted for the UK industry, and then it's lobbied to the government, which then also acts as a stakeholder in contributing to drafting these documents. So there's a whole industry engagement going on in terms of standardizing all sorts of things, whether it's regulatory, contractual, and technical even. So yes, so there's a lot to learn also from the oil and gas standardization process, and definitely stressing that there should be some looking into on the contractual frameworks also used by oil and gas companies in this context as well.
No, that's great, thank you. And I think you've brought up a really important point, which is that standards can very much be led by industry as well, defining what they want that best practice to be. I think that's something that we see in the space industry as well. So the Space Safety Coalition, for example, is an industry-led consortia that has adopted, I'm going to get the name wrong, but a kind of list of space sustainability kind of mandate in terms of what they want industry to adopt as a best practice. And so it's great to see that coming from industry as well as being coming from the top down from government as well. So Sara, is there anything else you want to add on this point?
I think it's been well covered by the experts. I think from a technical angle, I think just a thought on collaboration really. If you are trying to reach consensus on standards and regulation, from a technology point of view, it means we're all pushing in the same direction and trying to find solutions. So that can only be a good thing. And that idea of sharing is not a new idea. It's technology transfer is key in our sector. So we're doing quite a lot of work at the moment with Japan on things like Fukushima, and taking technologies that will be developed for that into Japan, but we'll also then reuse those in the UK later on. So I think international collaboration is key to our sector, and the more we can do to speak that common language is to be welcomed, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think very much true for the space industry as well, given that we're at a conference about the commons of space. This is very much a shared challenge that we all have to work together on. Fantastic. Well, I know that we've got a little bit of time for questions. I haven't seen anything in the chat yet, but do any of our audience members want to jump in with a question for our panelists? Don't be shy.
If I may jump in just while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I think one of the interesting areas that I've found while working on this report, and one of the things that I think we need to keep going and keep the momentum going moving forward, is the question of cost. There's going to be a cost associated with this, and in the other industries, there seems to be this well-established, or almost acceptance that, yeah, as part of the project, this is the cost of doing business. And I think that's something that we're going to have to roll out, not just within the space industry, but to elected representatives, to the people who hold the purse strings, that you're either going to pay for it now, or you're going to pay for it when there is some sort of disaster that happens. And I know which way I'd decide. I'd sooner pay for it. I don't know if that seems a fair finding, but I think that's one of the things that seems to come through, the fact that this is going to cost, and we're going to have to just accept it.
If you don't mind me jumping in, Chris, look, you always got to follow the money. I think everybody agrees that, we want to take care of the environment, we want to decommission, but you have competing interests. Someone is investing X amount of cash to produce something and they want their return. On the other hand, you have the government, which needs to manage, the expectations of investors. They need to manage the expectations of, the public, stakeholders, campaigners like Greenpeace. There are a lot of competing interests. But at the end of the day, I think that, sorry, let me take that back. Before we go to the end of the day, I think the key difference between oil and gas companies and space companies is that space companies do have a level of attitude of saying, look, we're developing technology, we're doing something phenomenal, it's great for human mankind, let me do it, let me drop my waste in orbit. And I understand that narrative, whereas an oil and gas company is very much, we got to satisfy shareholders, we're going to make a lot of money, we're going to produce as much oil, this is a low risk area, we're going to invest in it. And its interest is almost presented as the interest of the company, whereas satellite companies, space companies try to make you feel as an outsider that you're part of their journey, you're part of their investment, their success is your success. So what I'm trying to get to is, I think once a sector becomes well developed and well invested in, companies should not be treated as heroes. And satellite companies do have an obligation to decommission just as much as oil and gas companies have an obligation to decommission in their activities. And I think this is the key differentiator. And in your report, you've noted the government's inability or unwillingness to accept any indirect decommissioning liabilities arising due to the state responsibility principle in the Outer Space Treaty. So in my view, this is what you really first need to resolve, is how can a government get comfortable with allowing an oil and gas company, a space company, to undertake a decommissioning activity? We're trying to campaign to space companies to decommission when their governments are saying, sorry, we can't let you do that because we might end up paying for the bill. And this just goes back to exactly what you were explaining. You have to tie in the points of state responsibility with upfront security and managing all these indemnity caps that are quite fragmented in different jurisdictions and in the world. The UK has applied the indemnity cap for the first time a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, and it has finally tried to make it attractive for space companies to work out of the UK. So this is the balance that you need to find. Just follow the money, and someone needs to pay for it, and just try to allocate it. And the responsibility should rest with the satellite companies, I think, especially in the upstream sector, in the space upstream sector, to be clear.
Yeah, thanks for that, Yanal. I think you raised a number of really interesting points. And one of the challenges that we identified in the report was looking at the challenges associated with decommissioning financing, because as you mentioned earlier, the challenge is that once a satellite or any asset reaches the end of life and it's no longer generating revenue, that is a very hard time to start thinking about how you're going to fund your cleanup. Whereas if we go to Emma's point right at the beginning, is if you think about decommissioning or end of life as an integrated and necessary part of your satellite life cycle, you can start thinking about decommissioning and end of life at the design phase during your operational phase. And so once you get to end of life, it no longer is that afterthought, which can be somewhat challenging to deal with, but is something that you are prepared for and financially, able to take on that liability. Fantastic. Well, I think what we'll do is I'll just wrap up with our final question to our panelists, because we've learned a lot about other sectors in this panel discussion, which has been fantastic. Given what all of you know about the space industry, and we're very lucky to have panelists who are experts and connoisseurs in many fields, what are some of the key lessons learned or standards or solutions to decommissioning that you see in other sectors that you think can be brought into the space industry? We've already heard a number of great ideas from Yanal. Maybe I'll start with Emma. Thank you.
you very much. And so you talk about the things that can be brought in from other sectors to support the space industry. And so what I won't do in the short amount of time we've got left is point to things that people can search for themselves on the internet, the names of standards. If you search for sustainability, space, standards, there's so much good material out there, both in the space and the other sector. So I'd like to leave people with a thought. I started with my point about mindset, and I'd like to sort of encourage, picking out what Yanal says, the power of dissenting voices, talking about Greenpeace's challenges to Shell. And I'll just expand that slightly to the power of curious voices. If everybody in the space sector stepped back and said, what if, or said, what would happen if we did it this way? Or what would be the outcome if we did it this way? The range of outcomes associated with decommissioning would broaden. And so you get the flexibility and the cost element. So it really comes back down to, don't feel that just because you're not a space decommissioning expert, you haven't got someone to input to the discussion. Every input counts, every point of view counts, and this is one of the cornerstones of ensuring a safe and sustainable operation, irrespective of your sector.
That's great. Thank you, Emma. Sara, what would you bring from nuclear into the space industry?
I think it builds on what Emma just said, really. It's like, don't talk to yourself, talk to others. It's very easy to get into the mindset where we're building satellites and that's it, or we're doing space applications. I think there are technologies and approaches you can pull in from lots of other areas. We pull in technology from the space sector, we pull it in from transport, waste management, supermarkets, the gaming industry. I think don't constrain yourself to just talking to the sort of traditional technology, engineering, and those sorts of disciplines as well. Get some creative industries in there as well, because I think diversity of thought and opening up that discussion is really, really important. And I know there's a push within the space sector as well to increase diversity. Think about diversity of thought and skills as well as the sort of usual metrics. And I think it's keep having the conversations and keep reaching out across your networks and tapping into those other ways of thinking, because I think we're very, particularly in nuclear, it's quite a risk averse industry, and the tendency is to close down risk and close down options and conversations for valid reasons. I think we need to arm sometimes people with the skills to open up those conversations, and like Emma said, say what if, explore different ways of thinking, try and break that kind of fixedness that we've got, and that might some new ideas might emerge there. I think the other thing that I'd also encourage is transparency of information. We've been quite on a drive recently to make sure we're publishing our mission progress and what progress we're making. I think having that in the public domain kind of holds you to account. So if there's a way of doing that in the space sector, I think that public pressure and that accountability is a good driver too.
No, that's great. I like the idea of holding the space industry to account. That's a good one. Yanal, any closing remarks from you on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this with regret. However, unfortunately, I think the way to resolve decommissioning in the space sector will unfortunately have to happen through national jurisdictions. Every good thesis in space law ends with, we need an international convention where all countries sit together and agree on the best way forward. And it never happens. So, as much as I think that's the best way forward, I don't think it's the realistic way. It's a realistic way of resolving this. And I think decommissioning, we can have all sorts of discussions on the detail, but once it gets down to it, it will have to be regulated on a national level through a licensing regime, obliging licensees to comply with the decommissioning obligations to whatever country they're paying tax to. I think it should be a clear relationship, just like in any other sector. And that's always the difficulty with space law questions. Who's responsible for what, and who's managing this, and what state is supervising this? So I really think it should be done in a fragmented way, and I do say this with regret, and through national jurisdictions. And whoever does it best, let them offer space companies an amazing environment for operating out of their jurisdiction. It will unfortunately lead to forum shopping as always. But yeah, that's my concluding regretful remark on the issue.
No, I think that's really great, and I think you touched on something right there at the end, which is, regulation can be seen as a stick, but it's also you know, a potential driver of robust confidence in an industry, right? So I think what we really need to see in the space sector is regulation being seen as a, you know, looking for that race to the top. How can you show that you are a robust and safe and reliable space company by demonstrating that you are operating in a well-regulated regime? It's what we see in other sectors as a real strength, right? Fantastic. So we are out of time. I want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists here. It's been such an interesting discussion. I think I'll maybe just spend 30 seconds summarizing some of the highlights that I've taken away from this. Really what we've seen is, you know, the objective for decommissioning across different industries is very much shared. We're looking at managing the environmental impact of our actions and protecting safety across the board. And decommissioning is ultimately about reducing risk in whatever industry that we're looking at. We've talked about standardization. We've looked at integrating decommissioning into the life cycle rather than it being this far afterthought. And also this balance of risk and opportunity, which I think is a really interesting point that was made. I'll close on just one final takeaway that I got from Sara, which is let's keep this interdisciplinary conversation going. You know, I think there's a huge amount that we can learn from these other industries to bring into the space industry. I'd very much recommend everyone to have a read of our report that Astroscale in collaboration with Northumbria have just published, looking at these shared challenges that we see across industries and what we can learn for the satellite industry. But that is it from us. Thank you so much. And we would love to continue the discussion on the IASC Slack channel. So please do reach out. Thank you.
Take care.
So much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.